I'm biased, but I'm also a musician, and he could possibly be the best orchestrator America has produced. It's possible. If not, he's definitely in the top three.
William Grant Still, Jr. was born in the southwest corner of Mississippi in May 1895. His father, William Sr., was, among other things, a music teacher who traveled 75 miles from Woodville, Mississippi to Baton Rouge, Louisiana every time he wanted to take a cornet lesson. When he got enough training, he founded Woodville's only brass band. The elder Still's success, though, brought him the ire of his community. The Stills owned a sizable chunk of land and outshone many of Woodville's white residents in that regard, and that was dangerous. Still was the principal of the black-only school in nearby Gloucester when the only other black teacher there was lynched after complaining about pay inequity. According to the Still family, Still Sr.'s sudden death, when his son was just a few months old, was due to a poisoning, part of a larger plot to get the Stills to sell their land. And while this didn't work at the time, the intimidation from Woodville's white population prompted all of the extended Still family to leave by around 1920. This is as good a time as any to mention that the vast majority of information that we have about William Grant Still comes to us through the writings of either Still himself or his family. The story that I'm telling you today is as close to a truth as I can independently verify from my vantage point, considering that much of the literature on Still comes from a place of potential familial bias. Circumstances of Still Sr.'s death aside, his widow, Carrie Lena Fambro Still, now with no reason to stay in Mississippi, moved her and her son to Little Rock, Arkansas. His eventual stepfather, a railway postman named Charles B. Shepperson, was a music lover who brought in enough money to buy records and take the family out to shows. Shepperson made for a great stepfather, introducing William to all sorts of new things and getting into adventures and scrapes themselves. One time they had to climb up a pole to catch an escaped turkey destined for the Thanksgiving table. He had a mischievous streak. He liked to claim that his middle name was Buttermilk. I'm not even sure that William knew what his stepfather's middle name ever was. Now, Little Rock had segregation. It had violence, it had police brutality, it had shootings. For all its faults and flaws, though, it was much better to be black there than in most places in the South, or indeed places outside the South. Still reported that he had a typical American middle-class boyhood, which he credited to his family but also to Little Rock itself. Far before it became a flashpoint for the school integration fight, the community stood apart in the Jim Crow South for having the sorts of integrated neighborhoods in which Still grew up.
After the Civil War, Arkansas was literally the frontier. Like on the western border of Arkansas was tribal land. It was put out among Black Americans that Arkansas was going to be the place to be. There was what they called Arkansas fever. The first constitution they created had extended full civil rights to Black Arkansans. It provided for the creation of state universities, established the first state-supported public school system. So many African Americans moved there that by 1900, 30% of Arkansas's population was Black, and almost half of Little Rock's population was Black. Of course, it was not free of racism, but when my grandfather grew up there, it was a, comparatively speaking, good place for African Americans. And he had both white friends and Black friends.
From an early age, he believed that there were good, honest people, and they were the vast majority. As a kid, he worked odd jobs to earn the things that he needed, part of his mother's strategy to instill a strong work ethic in her son. And it worked out. Throughout the 1940s, Still would put up to 16 hours a day on his music. When he was in his mother's classroom as a student, he reported being singled out. It reads like his mom was just overcompensating for her son being in class. There was no way the other kids were going to think he was a favorite. Carrie was involved in the formation of local NAACP. She put on stage productions to help fund a new library open to Black patrons. She stopped young William from tracing objects or copying existing drawings for fear of dampening his originality.
She was an incredible activist. And this whole time, you know, some scholars say that Carrie Still Shepperson and Ida B. Wells were two of the most vocal anti-lynching advocates in the South. So at the same time that she was actively fighting lynching, standing up and telling the Black men of Arkansas that they needed to get a spine and protest, that she was leading all these protests, that she was being vocal at all these things, she was not bringing that home to him. She was protecting him from it. His mother was just a towering figure, and he absolutely believed in not just the equality of the sexes, but I think in some ways he felt women were better and smarter. In most of his interviews, he would say, I would be nothing without my mother. And of course, nobody took him seriously. And so her legacy has been mostly forgotten.
And like many in that era, corporal punishment was just how life worked. Carrie walloped her kid for minor infractions of civility, as well as almost burning down the house. Twice. You'd think that at some point she might notice that the beatings might not be doing anything, but the beatings continued until morale improved. She was nothing if not a headstrong, insistent woman. She had one child, one chance at molding a man who would dare to have a legacy, one boy who just might beat the odds and make something of himself out in the larger world. Her disciplinarian streak was offset by Anne Fambro, his maternal grandmother, who liked to spoil him with as much ice cream as he could eat. Reminds me of my grandmother. She always said that it was a breakfast food because it was a dairy product. She also introduced young William to the world of spirituals, and by extension, her faith. In exchange for supplying candy and ice cream, young William would read books to her out loud as she did the housework. It got him more fluent, and it gave her something to pass the time, as she was, like many in her generation, illiterate. Carrie made him take violin lessons when he was in school, and as soon as he learned how to read music, he wanted to write it. But to Carrie, Black musicians tended to be drunkards and gamblers, not the high social mobility types, not people who were really respected in society. They were far from what she wanted her son to be. As he grew older, he realized how strong bigotry was, that it prevented such an otherwise visionary woman from envisioning the path that her son would end up taking. William was always getting into trouble of some kind, and though he loved music, he cycled through other interests with great regularity. It makes sense that she might think of this as just one of his fads. He reported wanting to be a chicken farmer, for instance, around the time he was sent off to college. After graduating high school at 16, Still was fated to go off to Wilberforce University in Ohio, on a career trajectory we might call pre-med today. He had no particular love for medicine or the sciences, or for that matter, Wilberforce's militaristic educational environment. He loved music, and at Wilberforce he could not leave music alone. Billy Still, as he was known there, preferred serenading the women's dormitory with his violin instead of hitting the books. He put together a string quartet, and he learned a smattering of woodwind instruments so he could play in the band. His professors encouraged his musicianship and helped put together a recital of his music as well. He didn't have a career as a concert violinist, he said, because he enjoyed learning new instruments rather than becoming elite on just one. He practiced on his $8.50 oboe, and he snuck in sheet music to study in science class. And he even took over the band. It was this contribution to campus life that likely kept him from being expelled for his myriad pranks and rule violations. Until one day, it didn't. By his fourth year at Wilberforce, he had made up his mind to become a composer, but he never graduated. Still recounted that he fell victim to what he called a neat little scheme to catch him and some of his friends out for a walk with some girls, which was a big no-no. He left before he could officially graduate, believing that they were about to use this incident as a pretense to finally expel him. Still was stuck in Ohio, afraid to go back to his unapproving mother, his beloved grandmother now dead, and with no degree in hand. And the girl he was caught with, Grace Dorothy Bundy, seemed to have felt bad for him, tracked down his address, and soon they were married. it would prove to be the biggest mistake of his life. Still barely knew this girl during the incident, and maybe he should have been a bit more skeptical of her letters. His mother sure was, and her instincts proved right. Grace destroyed whatever correspondence that she could get her hands on, began spending money they did not have on things they did not need, complained to him that he needed a better job, and then, when he didn't immediately switch careers, she moved out to live with her parents in tiny Danville, Kentucky. Columbus, Ohio, where Still had ended up working various odd jobs, was not the best place to live in terms of career opportunities, but it actually offered some opportunities. Danville did not.
We have a very detailed record from the divorce proceedings. It was not as easy to get a divorce at that time. So we not only have grandfather's own timeline of what happened with Grace, but we also have statements from people who knew both of them about her. And she was awful. She was abusive. Grace appears to have been just a toxic presence in his life. And I feel so bad for him. When you read like his diary, she just tortured him.
William was lonely. His wife was living a train right away, but it led to his first connection to the industry. His stepfather had met W.C. Handy on a train, and Handy had heard of William Grant Still Sr., so he figured to give Jr. a try. 1916, he went to Memphis to work for Handy, and there, William Grant Still first heard the blues. It was one of many eye and ear opening moments on the Handy circuit. Still orchestrated for Handy, who billed himself as the father of the blues, and he played oboe and cello in his ensemble, which toured around the South enduring truly unimaginable conditions. A common experience to the other folks who were in the band, but it was new for Still, who quickly realized how sheltered he'd been. Sleeping on a freezing cold floor after eating even more miserable food night after night was preferable to being like the victim of a lynching. That's a pretty low bar.
He talks about sitting on the porch in Arkansas and seeing a white mob emerge from the trees, all carrying guns and searching for a black man who'd been accused, probably falsely accused of something. He saw at another point a man being attacked, viciously attacked. He witnessed a lynching when he was growing up. The difference is that as a child, he saw these things and they made a big impression on him, but I don't think he really took them in until he was traveling with Handy, and that's when he seems to have really understood the widespread nature of this, that these weren't isolated incidents, and also how much it was going to limit him.
Still recounted later that one night, while praying that he might fight racism through his music, an angel appeared to him and promised him that music would work out for him as a career so long as he kept the faith. I will note that a good chunk of the literature on Still refers to Handy as a composer of popular music, which is true, and it distinguishes Handy from the classical Western art music tradition, but this dichotomous attitude between classical and popular music rubs me the wrong way. However, it is reflective of how Still understood what he wanted to do in relation to what he was doing. Still contrasted the life arranging and performing to the formal classical training that he received in little fits and starts. The first chunk of this training came when he received a small chunk of money that his father had left for him in his will. When 22-year-old Billy was visiting Grace and her, possibly their, child, she suggested that he use that money to go take classes at the Oberlin Conservatory. The money was spare. He was forced to wear one of Shepperson's suits, safety pinned to fit his frame, and he had to scrape by on food to make the money last all of one semester. He studied violin and music theory during that semester, and his professor in the latter, Friedrich Lehmann, was taken with his setting of a Paul Laurence Dunbar poem as a class assignment. And then he learned that Still wasn't studying composition, and in fact would leave Oberlin entirely for the next semester because he couldn't afford comp lessons. So Lehman convened the theory committee, and they found the money. They arranged for Still to get a special scholarship so he could study composition with George W. Andrews. When the U.S. entered World War I and the draft began, many black Americans, unwilling to fight on behalf of the country that did not seem to care about them, they tried to find ways around it. You could try to dodge the draft and stay in the country, but that'd just make your life a lot more dangerous. You could go elsewhere. Brazil was a pretty popular destination, but it took money to get there, and the citizenship and language barriers were also pretty costly. Still solution? Enlist in the band. Only they didn't allow black people to enlist. So he went into the Navy. His thought was, well, if he couldn't play in a band, maybe if he was in the Navy, he could at least see a little bit of Europe along the way, see the place where a lot of the music he loved came from. This didn't pan out either. He was not treated as an equal unless the ship was actively under attack. That is, until he began playing the violin to accompany rudimentary movie projections. Still realized that even those who harbored deep prejudices against people of his skin color still generally liked listening to black musicians and would readily acknowledge their talent. He also traced the beginning of the civil rights movement as we know it to the treatment of black people in the Navy during this conflict. After Still's stint in the Navy and a brief return to Oberlin, Still returned to a penniless existence, rotating between odd jobs and gigs, several of which resulted in his violin getting destroyed.
I am never going to financially recover from this.
Fortunately, that was not his only instrument. To make ends meet throughout the 1920s, he said yes to anything musical, and I mean anything. He had to play an oboe held together with rubber bands, he'd say yes. There was a banjo at part, and he never even so much as touched a banjo. He would say yes, then he'd get a banjo, he'd learn to play the banjo, and then play the banjo when the show opened. For Shuffle Along, Still was the oboist and had pitched in with the orchestrations as well. He played in the pit for a year, and when the Smash It show went on the road to Boston, Still plotted a way to get training at the New England Conservatory. Still studied with George Whitefield Chadwick at NEC for as long as Shuffle Along was playing in Boston, which turned out to be about 3 months, which Chadwick insisted would be tuition-free. Still had promised Grace to leave and try to find employment back in New York City as soon as the Boston residency ended. And even though he took a massive pay cut, he was lucky to find a job in New York City at a new enterprise called the Black Swan Phonograph Company, the first all-black enterprise of the sort. And now his personal life was continuing to fall apart. Charles Shepperson had died quite suddenly by drowning in an uncovered outhouse pit. And worse, Grace had moved in with him in New York and brought her parents along. Long story short, her dad pulled a gun on Still. Then she decided to buy a house, took in a series of lunatic boarders to cover the cost, then convinced her parents to sell their place in a little podunk Danville so they could live in New York with them. The only thing that I liked was her cooking, Still wrote. There was nothing about me that she liked. The professional front was a little bit better, especially because Still was building up an impressive network as an arranger. While working in New York as a recording director for the Black Swan label, he heard that the French expatriate ultramodernist Edgar Varèse was offering a scholarship to a black composer. Varèse had hit upon the idea after a chance encounter with a member of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, Colonel Charles Young, the third ever black West Point graduate. Varèse contacted the folks at Black Swan for some names he might consider, and from that Still won the scholarship. He was my friend in the true sense of the word, Still later wrote. When he gave with all his heart. Varèse exposed his student to all sorts of modernist sounds and dissonances, but was not the kind of teacher who could only teach his own style. He encouraged, in Still's words, absolute freedom in composing. It was a process, though, not an event. Still admitted to coming under the sway of Varèse's dissonant style for a host of early pieces that started to bring him critical attention. Under Varèse, he wrote From the Land of Dreams, which was maybe his most modernist piece, and perhaps his most successful, at least up until that point. It certainly got the press talking and taking sides. His next big piece, Darker America, premiered in November 1926, and was more original, yet not quite out of Varèse's shadow yet. Still had learned a great deal from Verna, but wasn't quite there, in his words, when it came to the question of form. Like many composers in the early stage of their careers, he had a tendency to use many more themes than he needed, and other experiments with the various orchestral effects that he felt didn't quite pop off as they looked like they might on the page. He was still learning. Later in life, he proposed a traveling laboratory or reading orchestra to give aspiring orchestral composers a resource to hear their work played live. The experience of having an orchestral idea, trying it out, and noting the results, for good or ill, was one of the things that led him to develop what we hear today as a more conservative voice, in comparison to the modernists like Verna, who seemed to rule the day and are still taught in music history textbooks. The pieces that Still wrote under Verna's tutelage had the advantage of being reviewed in the papers, which he sent back to his mother, which finally convinced her that music could be a legitimate, respectable career for her son. She got to see just a glimpse of her son's success before she died of cancer in 1927.
New York was not friendly to him at all. New York at that time was, especially the classical music scene, was not only not welcoming to Black people, but it wasn't welcoming to him in particular. It was really controlled by this small group of influential white musicians and composers. For a period of time, especially people like Olin Downs and others, they would constantly criticize anything he wrote that was not racial in character, that did not include jazz or blues. Part of him felt like, look, I can write whatever music I want. Stop trying to say that you can write any kind of music, but I'm supposed to only write Black music. And he also, that's a period of time when he was saying, look, if I write it, it's Black music. It doesn't matter if it has jazz in it or not. No matter what he wrote, it was never not going to be connected to race, and it was never going to not be political.
Still abandoned Veresian ultramodernism, a potentially lucrative niche, as it did not align with his creative goals. Like many composers and artists of that time, he saw his role as furthering the status of his race. In other words, success had a political dimension in addition to the personal. It was in this period that he wrote From the Black Belt, Africa, a ballet called Saji, and his most famous piece, the Afro-American Symphony. When we think of Black music in the United States, we usually think of things like jazz, the blues, even rock and roll. Earlier than that, go back to ragtime, spirituals. The Black community for a time turned on spirituals, turned on the blues because of their untoward associations with slavery and dive bars, respectively. But in that rejection, what was there left as an oral signifier of their culture and community? Would it be as Harry Burleigh did in taking spirituals and arranging them, intersecting as that does with the kind of respectability politics? Or do you take the idiom, the style extracted from a corpus of music, recognizable as such but not a direct quotation of anything, as a signifier of your heritage, and then elevate that? That's what Still did with the blues, which were considered lowly and sultry. The idea that it was a legitimate form of musical expression, a cry of a trodden people worthy of elevation and immortalization on the orchestral stage, that was what was so new. Not that composers hadn't been inspired indirectly by the blues and other similar forms of Black American vernacular music, but no one resolved to do it as seriously and as systematically in the Afro-American Symphony as William Grant Still. Sometimes Grace would actually make good suggestions. They almost always involved him being away in some capacity, but sometimes it's exactly what he needed. In 1930, she suggested that he rent a spare room and move the piano there so he could have a separate composing space. And in that room, he wrote the Afro-American Symphony. The idea to elevate the blues to the refined heights of the symphonic repertoire was one that he said he kicked around in his head for some years, and in the build-up to the actual composition of the thing, he wrote down a number of themes and then categorized them by their mood. And then he credited the Great Depression for leaving him out of work for just long enough to pull the piece together. He described the process almost like a series of layers. First were the themes, then he found out what the form needed to be, then he figured out the melody, the harmonies, the variations, and finally the orchestration, and then the overarching program. Titles were also generally part of the final finishing touches for him as well. This differs from his later compositional descriptions, which we'll get to in due time. The divestment of melody from harmony really intrigues me. Like, I don't think of these as being necessarily separate things in my own compositional work. The fact that he did, I think, explains the constant overt sense of lyricism in this piece, deeply informed by the blues, down to a performance note about performing the dotted 8/16 rhythms as triplets, swinging them in a way that's not quite what's written on the page. It's also the first symphonic piece of any note to use a banjo, a claim that's still always maintained and that musicology has yet to debunk. The blues as a genre impacts phrase structure, melody, and harmony. The flattened or blue notes of the scale are often rendered as optional flat thirds and sevenths in an otherwise major mode context, while the triadic harmonies are embellished by added tones, particularly the added seventh. This generates a sonority that we hear in a classical context as an unstable dominant seventh chord, but the blues and music derived from the blues use this as a stability, as a consonance. Harmonically, added tone chords outnumber simple triads in this piece by a ratio of 2-to-1. Still also retain the 12-measure phrase structure of a typical blues piece, because for Still, form was either the second or third most important element of a composition. He usually put it after melody and sometimes also harmony. Different quotes on this seem to disagree, perhaps because he changed his mind over the years. Either way, form has an important structural, but still melodically subservient role. Still preferred taking established forms from the repertoire and deforming them to fit the needs of a melody and its development. Sonata form was sonata form for a reason in his mind. If you deviated from it, it had to be for a justified reason. It had to be because the material needed to be in a different form. The Afro-American Symphony was premiered in October 1931 in Rochester, New York by Howard Hanson and the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. Hanson, in his position at the Eastman School, was a great proponent of Still and his music and would invite Still to lecture to Eastman's orchestration classes. When he learned that Still wasn't at some of the premieres because he couldn't afford the train ride across the state. While Still was fine getting the credit as the first Black American composer to have a symphony performed, he never touted it as such because he suspected that Edmund Thornton Jenkins, who had immigrated to England in 1914, may have beaten him to the punch. While Jenkins was the first Black American to get a world premiere of a symphony, Still's was the first in the United States. Between this and his ballet Saji, he really felt like he made it as a mature composer. And Still was in a prime position to rack up many more firsts, including as a conductor, first with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and in 1955 with the New Orleans Philharmonic, which up until that point was an all-white ensemble. Several other innovations were credited to Still, sometimes by Still himself, including the introduction of unusual trumpet mutes and the vibraphone in the orchestra, as well as the aforementioned banjo and a fingernail pizzicato technique. I'm not sure if any of these can be definitively proven, but even if somebody else technically beat him to it, he at least came up with these timbral ideas independently.
When I was in school at University of Michigan, I remember they were getting ready to play one of my grandfather's pieces, and a trumpeter friend of mine said, "Oh God, we're going to play Still. I need to get out all my mutes," because he uses so many different mutes. He wants a specific sound, and he knows how to get it.
Still had crossed paths with some important Black musicians, but it was a hard uphill battle to be taken seriously as one, something he had found out firsthand when he was, in his words, thrown out on his own after Wilberforce. The money to be made in music was, as he found, in the commercial scene, from W.C. Handy to Shuffle Along to a host of other gigs. He orchestrated for Paul Whiteman up until the Great Depression, where he honed his symphonic chops. He made a distinction between commercial arrangements and true orchestration. The former for him was about flashiness, about constant creativity, always mixing it up, even when the musical materials didn't call for it. In orchestration, repeating a color was a given. The timbres that you chose emerged from the nature of the material that you were orchestrating. Even after Whiteman let him go, he planned on commissioning Still for several pieces once he got his finances back together. And while staying with Whiteman in Los Angeles, Still first met the pianist Verna Arvey. And California changed him too. He was far away from grace and steeped in spiritualism of all stripes. Everything from latter-day Gnostic sects to numerology to theosophy was on the table, in addition to all the major established religions, of course. That's LA for you. This colored his belief in God as a source of all creative ability, and he dedicated all of his work to the Almighty for granting him the gift of inspiration. He began to put much more stock in his dreams as premonitions, messages from God, or just passages of music that he needed to write. When the World's Fair came to New York City at the end of the 30s, the Theme Search Committee listened to a lot of anonymous musical snippets to decide which composer they wanted to commission. They heard 2 pieces by Still, not knowing they were by the same guy, and they said, "We'd be happy with the composer of either of these 2 samples." This man got his music into a huge blind competition without even knowing it, and he earned first and second places at the same time. That's pretty cool. And he credited his success to many things. To God first and foremost, but also to his experience in popular music. "I think it has so many elements that are American, unmistakably so," he later said, adding that any aspiring composer who wanted to write in an American style had to be familiar with popular music. That was an inextricable part of the American musical identity to his ears. Still became the first black composer whose music was heard across the country over the radio. In the 1930s, he was part of the Deep River Hour, where he conducted the Deep River Orchestra. Creative naming convention, I know. The program featured spirituals and arrangements of other popular music for orchestra. And Still's work as the orchestrator was somewhere between arrangement and composition. He was given free rein to reimagine well-known music while also scoring it out. And his work got so sophisticated for the orchestra that the orchestra figured, hey, the guy who wrote it should probably just conduct it and make it a lot easier. Trouble was, at that point, William Grant Still had never conducted an orchestra, so they had to explain the basic mechanics, and they taught him even more about orchestration along the way. So in a later interview, Still recalled that his time with the Deep River Hour allowed him the space to try out all of his little pet theories about orchestration. It was an open secret in New York City that William Grant Still was one of the best orchestrators around, but he often went uncredited for his work. In some cases, it was outright stolen by others, including by Will Votery, who hired Still to help him meet a deadline and then copied Still's scores in his hand and took credit for them.
Will Votery didn't just crib his music, he took money. That was basically taking money from him. He was taking work from him, which at that time, grandfather was, I mean, he was never wealthy at all, but he was living hand to mouth, right? Like it was consequential. There was also a running joke at that period during the Harlem Renaissance of Gershwin walking around Harlem with a stack of ones saying, "Hey, could you hum that again?" White musicians and composers were constantly stealing from Black musicians because they could. And it prevented Black musicians from making money. You see in Grandfather's diaries over and over, there's one point which just broke my heart where he's like, "Do they not want me to make a living?" He forgave a lot of things over the course of his life. I mean, he used to, Gershwin stole the melody for I Got Rhythm from him, and he would just laugh about it. I mean, if you listen to the Afro-American Symphony, to the third movement, the scherzo, you'll hear him quote I Got Rhythm in the brass. That isn't him being a jerk. That's him. That's a wink. That's a joke to the audience and to himself. Grandfather's musical voice and his orchestrations were so unique that even though it was written in Votery's hand, he said, "This sounds a lot like William Grant Still." I mean, that even at that young age, that's how distinctive that sound was.
In other respects, Votary did help Still's career, because it was through Votary that Still first met Don Voorhees, whose program, on the first day of CBS's existence as a network, aired nothing but William Grant Still arrangements. He also met singer Florence Mills through playing in Votary's orchestra, and for her, wrote the orchestral song cycle Levyland. Mills was a stranger to the classical world and had to learn the music by ear, note by note, Still coaching her through every last line.
Levyland is such an interesting piece. It was the last time he ever wrote his own lyrics. He felt that he'd done such a laughably horrible job at writing lyrics that he never just wanted to do it again. So he wrote this piece while he's studying with Varese, and there's all this atonality in it, but he's also just beginning to sort of use real jazz, actual jazz in a classical format, but it still has a banjo in it. I mean, it's just this really interesting sound. And I don't think there's anything else in his entire catalog that sounds the way that Levyland does, especially since he wrote it for a woman who could get away with doing an entire movement with no lyrics at all, just kind of humming sounds. And another one where the entire lyric is, hey, hey. I mean, it requires a lot of presence in order to be able to carry that off.
Hey, hey. Hey, hey.
He was a really young man. I mean, he wasn't considerably older than I was when I sang it. It was also really difficult. I mean, as a singer, he doesn't give you a lot of help. He doesn't give you a lot of help in finding your notes. He doesn't give you a lot of help in supporting the notes that you're singing. You're not going to hear them in the orchestra behind you very well. So it's tough. And the vocalizations are tough, really, really tough. He didn't really write music for my voice. I'm a lyric color to a soprano, and he liked the meatier voices a lot. So he didn't really write for me, but when you're singing his music, it feels good in your throat. Especially his later pieces. It feels good to sing. It's not particularly easy to sing, but it feels good.
Foxes, is your God religion? And if you is, do you want to keep it? You ask me what? Well, I had religion once, but I done lost it. You ask me how? Jazz. Hi, son Simmons. He lives for Baptist Park. Used to say this word each Sunday. I don't mean for the mark. Oh, brethren and sisters, mother's gone to the promised land. Course, I was always amongst the first to answer up, amen. Does you want to join her on a final judgment day? Then you's got to travel the long and narrow way. So I've done my level best to live right every day. But the devil, he was a little scared about what the folks might say. But laws, I just forgot it all when the band got up to play. Foxes, when them fiddles sob and cry and then go kind of fast and spry, I felt a legion going. When that banjo go plunk plunk and father up went brrrrunk, I felt a legion going. When I hear that cornet play, seemed like my troubles rolled away, and I felt a legion going. The band would play that slide trombone, he fairly made it whoa, 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 whoa. I felt a legion going. And then that saxophone, it starts, seemed like them tones just touched my heart, and I felt a legion going. When they all joined in and flowed, I just couldn't stand no more. I jumped right out onto the floor and swayed my body to and fro, and I know the legion was gone. Oh, I know it's wrong to stray, but if you'd hear that jazz band play, you'd feel a legion
Still's music extended far beyond the most significant chunk of his ethnic heritage. After his run of race pieces through the early 1930s, he began to think of black music as a limiting and perhaps even racist characterization. And you can kind of see where he's coming from. A black man writing music needn't be known as a black composer, any more than a woman writing music needs to always be known as a female composer. If you believe that music is music, and music stands on its own turf, in some sense apart from the identity of its creator, I'm sure you can sympathize with Still's position here. His final turn as a composer was towards individuality, a period that lasted from the mid-30s to the rest of his life. In 1932, Grace took her mother and her, maybe their, 4 children to Canada to follow one of her lovers who had fled north after committing some sort of crime. Still missed the kids, and while it did drive him to drink for a little bit, he reported feeling relieved above all else, and understandably so. He had caught her cheating on him, and so she took chocolate, put poison in it, and tried to get the kids to feed it to him. Then when he was in California, she tried to hire someone to poison him there too. There's a lot of poisonings and attempted poisonings in this episode. Did Vladimir Putin sponsor this? It took some years before Still first broached the topic of divorce, whereupon Grace told him that only one of their 4 kids was actually his. Her abusive ways didn't stop at the kids, which is unfortunate. In the eventual divorce, Still couldn't get visitation, let alone custody, but he paid alimony to Grace to fund the kids, even though there was no court order telling him to do this, and plenty of evidence to suggest that Grace was squandering and pocketing money intended for, like, the kids' clothes. In May 1934, Still arrived in Los Angeles, full-time on a Guggenheim Fellowship, freed from his old life, freed from bouncing from job to job, freed from the constant threat of being poisoned, apparently, and he reconnected with the pianist and journalist Verna Arvey, who would become his second wife. Still never gave up hope in people. He could receive all the racial hatred in the world and still not develop prejudice against white people, in the same way that being married to one absolute freaking lunatic did not dissuade him from marrying again. He first hired her as his publicist, and eventually they married in Mexico in early 1939, interracial marriage being illegal at the time in the United States. Arvey and Still were so elated to be married that they got a speeding ticket driving back home. Later that month, Arvey was the soloist in the Los Angeles Philharmonic's performance of Kaintuck, a fantasy for piano and orchestra dedicated to her. Arvey's career in journalism had prepared her for a later career as her husband's advocate in the written word. And this presents the most significant issue in Still historiography, one that, as far as I can tell, has yet to be remedied. Because the further and further you get into Arvey's writing, the vaguer it gets. She doesn't provide the same level of detail about their Los Angeles life in comparison to the trove of writing on Still's earlier life, his parents and grandparents, and even his first marriage.
My grandmother was strong and brilliant and extremely loving, and her biography of him is very problematic. It's not just problematic politically, it's also problematic racially, because if you've read it, you know that my wonderful, loving grandmother, brilliant grandmother, had a little bit of white lady syndrome, and she seems to be constantly speaking on behalf of both of them. When you read that book, he doesn't seem to be an individual. It's her and him all the time. And she seems to think that because she's married to a black man, she understands racism, and she clearly doesn't. Before judging my grandmother, I have to think about what that would do to me decade after decade. You know, they had to get married in Tijuana because it was illegal at the time. Most of her family disowned her because she married a black man. They had to put up a 6-foot fence around their property because at that time, people were dragging mixed race people out of their homes and assaulting them and burning down their houses.
She makes a lot of insinuations about communists and other leftists in high places with the intimation that they worked against Still and his career, that there was some anti-Still conspiracy with no concrete motivation. And she doesn't provide evidence to back this up. The reading it comes across as though conflated with the high modernist composers prominent in the American Academy of the time, with the implication that despite their appeals to equality, they were fueled by racism.
There really was a conspiracy against them. It wasn't a communist, you know, sifting through their trash conspiracy, but there really was discussions about him. There really were people talking to one another and preventing him from getting performances. And he would get a commission and then find out later that someone else had, you know, talked about him, and he lost it. When at one point when they made a whole bunch of recordings of American composers' music, and they sent all the discs to Europe to get them pressed into albums. When they arrived in Europe, mysteriously, only his were broken and unusable.
Still and Arvey developed an antipathy towards all things modern in music. Year after year, they wrote, the propagandists of meaningless noise continued to insist that their products, and only their products, had to be accepted whether anyone cared for them or not. His taste for a more conservative idiom, out of fashion with the big movers, shakers, and tastemakers of American music, reads as mutually antagonistic. They didn't like him, he didn't like them. Still, his compatriots felt like they were on the outside looking in. And Arvey mentions Deems Taylor several times in her biography as someone who fell from fashion because he refused to adopt dissonance. Still's distaste for his early modernist experiments grew out of his realization that traditional harmonies, traditional textures, traditional overt melodicism, which so many of his contemporaries seemed to resist, maybe wasn't so bad after all. Maybe there was still much you could do with tonal harmony as a point of departure for genuine expression. Was I really expressing myself when I wrote such bizarre intellectual stuff? Still wrote in his autobiography in reference to the things he wrote under VIII. It was not dissonance itself per se, or even the people who wrote dissonant music, but the people who claimed that their way was the only way. That was really what bothered Still.
He always believed that his music would be a bridge between the races. Always. And he, to that end, that's one of the reasons why he became and always was a melodist at the time when contemporary music was going full bore towards atonalism. You know, one critic at some point said, this is the kind of music you could walk out of the concert hall humming, as though that was an insult. But he said music is created for people, not for different classes, not for music conservatories. It's for people. And it should create a common bond between us. He saw music itself as a democratizing force.
No, Ruth, this is not a time for you. Still was the ultimate practical composer. He disregarded theories in favor of relying on intuition and experience. He emphasized emotional affect, not technique, and once quipping that his opera's audiences would not include other composers for that reason. Inspiration, the ability to take notes and transform them into music, was an act of spiritual communion. To that end, prayer was an important part of his compositional process. That and being open to inspiration whenever it struck. When the theme came to him in bed, as it often does for us composers, he wouldn't get up to write it down. Rather, he imagined what it looked like as notation, and he remembered that visual component. It was his practical experience at the heart of the American popular music industry that makes his music sound uniquely American. His mixed-race heritage may have had some small psychological impact, but to claim it as one of the primary factors for why his music sounds like his music, as Verna Arvey implied, I think that's just going too far. He also never learned to play the piano. We sort of accept this as the most common thing for a composer to do. Even if you're not a pianist by training, you have to have some facility with the keys. But lacking this experience, barely faking his way through rudimentary keyboard skills at Oberlin, meant that he never fell into the trap of writing for the piano and then orchestrating from there.
The vast majority of composers will write for piano first, and then they'll expand it for the orchestra or whatever ensemble they're writing for. He wrote from the very beginning for the orchestra as the instrument, meaning he wrote the first French horn and then second French horn line from beginning to end all the way through. It was never condensed for piano at any point. So I think it gives his work a very distinctive orchestral sound.
Still's critique of modernism was mostly in melody, which was, in his words, woefully lacking in so many contemporary composers, and in harmony, with its reliance on dissonance. For him, dissonance had artistic value, but when used for the sake of just having dissonance, he heard his contemporaries sacrificing their individuality, the core of their creative souls. Still's handling of dissonances, including polychords or major-minor chords, are mitigated by his orchestration choices. That is, he spaces out the notes, he assigns timbres to them in such a way that the crunch of the dissonance is minimized, not maximized. In an interview, Still said that he never approached his work from a conscious decision to do something different. The quality of a work was more important than how recently the work was completed. This isn't quite how he worked out his orchestral ideas, which was this trial and error process that he worked out during his time orchestrating for the radio. Rather, I think when he was talking about this, it was speaking to how he wrote music in his creative maturity. He felt that his contemporaries lacked a feeling for beauty. And he thought back to his experiences in Memphis, working for W.C. Handy. If he could be successful in pop music by tapping into the world of folk music, what was to stop a symphonic composer from doing the same? Music should serve others, just as religion serves mankind, he wrote. Still wrote for his audiences, quite openly and quite plainly. I suspect this is part of his commercial background as well, because the audience was the consumer. If he didn't provide something that they wanted to consume, In a sense, he didn't feel like he was doing his job. Unlike much of the academic world, Still didn't believe in a split between artistic merit and commercial success. The audience had the same right to free expression as the composer, an extension of free speech on both sides, if you will, and audiences voted with their money at the box office and with their butts in the seats. A composer's failure to consider the audience, he wrote, is an abuse of his own freedom. He felt that audiences had an intuitive understanding of form, be it in music, visual arts, or in architecture, and form to him was the equivalent of proportion. It was the only element of music, he believed, where the intellect should rule and not the heart. The more you apply intellect to your creations, he wrote, the further you get from God, or from intuition, if you prefer to call it that. Much of the magic of Still's music is in the orchestration. When asked to deliver a lecture on orchestration, Still analyzed his approach, and he summed it up in a few key points. The first was not overscoring, not giving into making something look visually appealing if we're dealing with something most people only ever encounter with their ears. 2, stick to only 2 melodies at a time as effective counterpoint. Any more than that, things get muddy. 3, keep the main melody clear. 4, vary the timbres as much as you can with the mood of the melody taking primary importance. 5, limit doubling and tripling of lines as much as possible. Too many instruments playing the same thing decreases the composite timbre's uniqueness. It kind of flattens everything out into a mush. It sounds less and less like a blend of those instruments and more just like a generic orchestra sound. He found this out the hard way. He wrote a unison line one time for a whole orchestra, as many instruments as could play it, and he realized how much the resulting sound sucked. 6, give everyone something that they like to play and want to play. Performers are people too, after all, and the more they play with feeling, the better the music's gonna sound.
You know, he was such a musician's composer. There's so many stories from other musicians about him hanging out in the rehearsal rooms and asking people how they liked their parts. And then he would change them. He never wanted to be Strauss, where a trombonist is playing umpas for 3 hours.
7, there are no hard and fast no's. Still gave several examples of specific combinations of instruments that he was warned against using and then finding ways of using them to great effect, like bass clarinet and brass, or celeste and tubular bells. Still was no stranger to unusual treatment of instruments, including the human voice. In his choral orchestral piece From a Lost Continent, he didn't go as far as saying that he used the voice as an instrument, but his description of the process, writing the notes, then going back over them with nonsense syllables to free the voices from being in service to the words that they were singing, sounds an awful lot to me like using voices as instruments. Still said that the more I learn of orchestration, the more I know how little I know of it.
Little black slave child, no slave to me.
Almost as soon as he heard an opera recording, he knew that was the music he most wanted to write. As a kid, he made his own manuscript paper and wrote, or tried to write, operas that he would send off to different composition competitions. One was only 20 pages long and was returned to sender with a note of complete puzzlement from the judges, who hadn't a clue of what to make of what they had received. He also just loved the theater in general, to the point of sneaking backstage just to soak up the smell. While at Wilberforce, he went to Dayton and Cincinnati just for the operas. You know, go to Dayton. I mean, that's really where all the great operas are. Opera was his first love and his eternal aspiration as a composer. Long after the days that scrawled juvenilia, he continued to pursue operatic composition. He wrote and discarded projects one after another, viewing them as stepping stones to his goals. Confronting him were 3 main issues. The first was American opera houses' conservatism. They only wanted to do the operas that had long since proven their worth in Europe. Second, sad to say, was his race. Third was the fact that composers' first operas generally are not that good. There are exceptions, for sure, but the only way to know if something works for the stage is to have something not work so well so you can learn from that experience. The constant work on incomplete operatic projects was about getting the experience necessary to not fail should he get the opportunity. I suspect he only felt he would get the one shot. One of the reasons he began writing symphonic music was his frustrations with and failures in breaking into the operatic world. Verna said that through the successes of premieres and many people who wanted new works, he had twin frustrated ambitions. The first was getting an opera done, and the second was getting his music properly recorded. And in both matters, still came to suspect that doing so required too many people in too many positions who all had to pull in the same direction and had to be, well, not racist. Still, Arvey shared the opinion that not all claims of racism were warranted, that it only functioned as an explanation of last resort. In other words, getting rejected by one player or another or several in the industry was just the way the industry worked. That was just getting rejected. We all had to go through it. Getting rejected by everybody in the industry, then you could start to suspect it. To jump to such a suspicion was in their minds a kind of giving up, which was anathema to the self-possessed, headstrong culture in which Still had been reared. There was one final chip on his shoulder too, and this one was more unique to him, because he didn't want to adapt a play. I don't quite know why. Plays are usually pretty adaptable to opera because they already work on stage, they've already proven their worth, but anyway. His first completed opera was a project called Blue Steel. It was written on a fellowship specifically to write an opera, and friends loved the music but still had his reservations. The plot provided by librettist Bruce Forsyth revolved around a cult in a swamp. Still thought that it was just too over the top, a little too Hollywood, a little too Creature from the Black Lagoon to become part of the repertoire. He was probably right about that, but what he was trying to do was almost impossible. Write a first opera that was not only really good, but good enough to immediately find a place in the repertoire. So he kept working on other projects until the right libretto came along, shelving at this point a completed opera. And come along it did. Still did not associate himself with the Harlem Renaissance as a broader cultural movement. He cited his Varesian work at the time as far outside what any other black composers who might be affiliated with the movement were doing. But he had some personal connections with some of its figures. He and Langston Hughes had moved in the same circles when they both lived in New York City, and at one point Still asked the writer, whose words he found very singable, for a libretto. Some years later, Hughes kind of randomly came through with a libretto called Troubled Island. The reason it was random is because it was intended for Clarence Cameron White. When White rejected it, Hughes remembered Still's conversation and offered it up. And Still lapped it up. He loved the story of the first emperor of an independent Haiti. But when Hughes set off for war-torn Spain and still needed to make some changes to the opera, his wife stepped in. She knew she could write, she was a journalist after all, but she doubted her poetic chops until her contribution became the highlight of the opera. From then on, they were a husband and wife creative team. Still sought out genuine Haitian music in order to give Troubled Island something of an authentic character, but he found scant resources in the United States. The only two snippets of Haitian music he could find that made it into the opera were themselves secondhand. They are recollections of the author John Craig, who had been stationed in Haiti during the period of U.S. occupation.
But where is Jean-Jacques? With the guard of slaves, the woods in the dark, comes Jean-Jacques, drawing near, by no one seen, still Jean-Jacques. Lest our masters become wise and learn too soon of our secret plans. By hidden paths through the jungle comes Jean-Jacques. Our people and bring to my little
Troubled Island would eventually receive its premiere in 1949, after a half-decade of attempts to get a production to an enthusiastic audience but cooler critics. Howard Taubman confirmed the still suspicions. A contingent of critics had conspired to critique Troubled Island on account of wanting to limit the number of successful black people in the industry. The first run closed after only a trio of performances. It got its 15 minutes of fame. The US government had recorded one of these performances and briefly blasted them out to be played on overseas radio stations, and its glowing reception among the audience allowed Still to believe that he could be an operatic composer. He had a taste of success, and he knew for sure that the people he cared most about, the listeners, the lay audience members, understood and liked what they heard. It spurred him to write more operas, which he did throughout the rest of his career. He understood that he needed to be involved in every stage of the production. In order to make sure that everything worked well on stage, he would construct scaled models of the set so he could visualize the action and pace the music accordingly.
He was a doting grandfather. I mean, he loved all children, but he pretty much thought his grandchildren were the best humans ever created. He always had a really great sense of humor. He had a light heart. He absolutely loved dogs. And, you know, I mean, he was everything you could ask for in a grandfather.
William Grant Still died after several strokes in December 1978 at the age of 83. Within a matter of years, Verna, who managed her late husband's legacy, would be left bedridden by the same cause.
He really only thought about writing music. There are so many stories of friends talking about his absent-mindedness, which really was just, and I saw this myself as a child, he would be thinking about music and hear nothing of what you're saying to him. You know, there's one story that a friend told him when he was still in Harlem where he talked to him for like 15 minutes. And at one point, grandfather turned around and goes, "Oh, I didn't see you get here." Or another one where he's sitting there at his desk and the friend says, "Oh, it's really hot." And grandfather looks up and goes, "Oh, is it? I guess I better take off my coat." My mother at one point, after he passed, looked through his diaries for her birth date because she was expecting to see, him writing about the birth of his daughter. And he said something like, hot day, Judith born at high noon, scored victory tide in the evening. And she's like, "What the hell?" And when she said that, my grandmother said, "Oh, I wouldn't feel bad. He was scoring and writing music on our wedding night."
Still led, all things told, an unusually fortunate life. He went through periods of poverty, for sure, and racial resentment, mistreatment in the South, Northeast, and even on the West Coast. But all things considered, he had the good fortune of, for instance, living in integrated neighborhoods for a large portion of his life. I don't doubt that this helped reinforce his belief in the God-given goodness of people. This is not to say that he hadn't witnessed violence, that he hadn't been its victim. He had. His mammoth work for 2 choirs and orchestra, and They Lynched Him on a Tree, came well after his racial period of pieces like the Afro-American Symphony or Darker America, and deals with truly brutal, horrifying subject matter that he knew from the inside.
Cars. It's mighty dark. Headlights showing where you park. It's mighty dark, and it's getting cold. Better go home now. The night's growing old.
Having grown up in a time when segregation was legal in a huge swath of the country, Still developed an antipathy towards radical protesters of the 1960s and 1970s. His view was that the black nationalism and separatism espoused by groups like the Black Panthers was the result of ignorance. He believed they pushed for neo-segregationist policies because they did not experience what segregation was like in the first place, how humiliating it was.
Grandfather was conservative politically. But I think that that was mostly a response to the fact that the people who shunned him and excluded him and really hurt him in New York were part of a very liberal socialist and communist group. That's what was happening with the elite musicians and critics in New York. And I think that his turn toward the conservative occurred mostly when he moved to California, putting not just geographic distance between them, but political distance as well. Yeah, at one point he says, look, I've been black for over 70 years. I've been a black man for over 70 years. I know how to be black. Please don't tell me how to be black. And that was really, I think, where that mostly stems from. I don't think it was so much his political views, the way we think of politics, as it is he was constantly resisting this attempt to tell him what to think, how to be, and claiming that they knew his identity or could define his identity. That is what he really hated. Although he was very socially liberal. I mean, he was the biggest feminist I know. He was socially liberal in a lot of different ways. He was absolutely had no animus whatsoever against members of the LGBTQ plus community. He had a lot of friends who were members of that community. Many of the things that we associate, the issues that we associate with conservatism, especially today, he was on the side of liberalism, lowercase liberalism, at those times. So, it's complicated. It's really complicated.
He went through hardship with his intense work ethic and his deep faith in God, and so he was able to pull himself up by his own bootstraps in a way that a lot of people of his race just weren't able to do. He refused to hire help to extract parts from his scores, which almost everybody did in the days before computerized software on account of the sheer time that it took. Still's objection to that practice began because he didn't have the money, but even when he could afford copyists, he actually preferred putting in those long hours in his studio instead, because this was his proofreading step. And then when he was done, he had this habit of completely reorganizing his workroom every time he wanted to start a new piece. Then he would forget where everything was.
And you did not disturb him when he was in his music room. But other than that, he had all kinds of really interesting hobbies. He made his own puzzles, and he was a really great gardener. And he he was a talented carpenter, and he made a lot of the furniture in their house. He made toys for his children that we weren't supposed to touch him, but we did. He had a whole closet full of reel-to-reel recordings of mostly his music, but other music as well. And he would sometimes bring out this really heavy player to play the reel-to-reels. He loved Westerns, and we would sit together on his lazy boy chair and watch Bonanza and Gunsmoke if that was on reruns.
Still's career gets to the heart of fundamental questions about America and its music. His work as an operatic composer turned symphonist by circumstance is maybe the closest we ever got to seeing Dvorak's ideals of an American music, born from African-American idioms, truly realized. The same year as the premiere of the Afro-American Symphony, John Tasker Howard said that Still sought an individual idiom halfway between the ultramodernists and the conservatives. This gave him enormous popularity in an area so dominated by those extremes. But by not staking a claim on either mountain, Still's legacy, especially since his death, has been hidden in the valley between.
Everyone sort of now assumes, we've all heard Still, but there's still a lot of his music that's never been performed before. Some of Grandfather's chamber music they're gems, these perfect little gems. When I hear his music, it makes me feel like he's with me again because his voice is so clear. If there is any questions about William Grant Still, they can almost all be answered in the music.